Hello and welcome to Group One's first webinar of the year this year. I'm David Graves, Group One's sales representative, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here today. Joining me today on today's presentation is Chris Wilson, our Marketing and Communications Director, and we would like to wish everybody a happy new year, although we're already pretty far into the year. Chris, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, David. Thank you for having me. I always appreciate being here at your webinars. It's always a pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, today we have a very exciting presentation lined up for everyone. We're going to be discussing some of the most common mistakes HR professionals make when ordering background checks for their organizations. Now, we can't cover every mistake, but we're going to cover a sizable amount of mistakes. But I also wanted to encourage our audience to, along the way, in the chat feature, you can do it, or you can email us at the end of the presentation, maybe share some of the mistakes that you've encountered when it comes to running background checks for your company. And if you'd like to share those stories with us, we'd love to hear them, and maybe it might make for maybe a future presentation that we could make, and we could share your stories and maybe address some of the mistakes and the solutions that go along with that on your mistakes. Additionally, if you have any questions during the presentation, we'd like to remind our audience that you can submit your questions to us in the comments section, and we'll do our best at the end to answer your questions. Before we begin, though, we have a disclaimer that we'd like to share with you.
Yeah, David, by all means, don't leave this out.
No, we want to remind everybody that we are not attorneys, unless, Chris, you've gotten passed your bar exam since we last spoke.
I'm afraid I haven't achieved it yet.
Me neither. So we're neither one attorneys. And the information that we're going to share today and the opinions that we express are for educational purposes only and are based on current practice, industry-related knowledge, and business expertise. The information should not be construed as legal advice, express or implied, and always, always, always consult your legal counsel when it comes to background screening compliance issues. All right. Well, that being said, let's go ahead and dive in here. Background screening is a very critical part of your hiring process, but it is really easy to make mistakes that can lead to legal issues, poor hiring decisions, and wasted resources. The webinar today will highlight some of those most common pitfalls in background screening and hopefully provide you some practical advice on how to avoid making those mistakes and ensure yourself a smooth and hopefully effective screening process. Now, today we're going to cover some of these on our agenda here, which is ignoring legal requirements, failing to obtain a consent, incomplete or inaccurate information, poor communication, bad timing, social media risks, inconsistent practices, employment and education history. We'll talk about that. Red flags. I like how you put the red on that flag there. Makes you very curious to what that's about. And then pre-adverse, adverse action letters, the dispute process, and then only relying on background checks when you're making a hiring decision. All right, and let's move on here to the first of our mistakes, and that is ignoring legal requirements.
Sorry about that.
Nice bell.
Ignoring legal requirements. Yes, you don't want to make that judge angry, right?
No, that guy looks very angry. Looks like he had a bad day already. But that is really the first mistake we want to talk about, which is not complying with local, state, and federal laws regarding background checks. One of the most significant mistakes employers can make when conducting background checks is failing to comply with a myriad of local, state, and federal laws that govern these processes when it comes to background checks. Non-compliance can lead to severe legal consequences, including fines, lawsuits, and maybe more importantly, damage to your company's reputation. And here are some of the key legal requirements that employers should be aware of. The FCRA, which stands for the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And as a background screening company, we're a consumer reporting agency, CRA. We fall under the guidelines of the FCRA. And it's the FCRA that sets the national standard for background checks conducted by third-party agencies like GroupOne or any other background check company. And it requires employers to, number one, provide a clear and conspicuous disclosure to the candidate. And that disclosure or non-disclosure agreement should be separate from the employment application, informing them that a background check is going to be conducted.
Yeah, this is very important, David. And I just read the other day, there's been a lot of companies who have made this mistake.
Yeah, it is a very common mistake. A lot of companies will assume that because they have some kind of a background statement that a background check is going to be pulled on their application, they assume that that is sufficient. And really, you need to make sure that it is clear and conspicuous, and that would be putting your disclosure on a separate written form for them to sign, either electronically or on paper. Second is to obtain written consent from the candidate before conducting the background check, which is what we're talking about here, and getting it before you pull the background check as opposed to after. And then also providing the candidate with a copy of their background screening report and a summary of their rights under the FCRA, especially if you take any kind of adverse action based on that report. Next, state and local laws. Many states and municipalities have additional regulations that go beyond the FCRA. For example, some jurisdictions have what's called ban the box laws, and those are laws that that prohibit employers from asking about a person's or a candidate's criminal history on the initial job application. Others may have specific requirements for how background checks are conducted and what information can be considered.
Hey, David, I have a question for you. Do they have ban the box laws in Texas?
Not at this time. The ones that come quickly to mind are California and New York, and there are other states that are following suit with the ban the box, but Texas has not as of yet.
Huh, okay.
The other one to be aware of is Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC guidelines. The EEOC enforces federal laws that prohibit employment discrimination. Employers must ensure that their background check policies do not disproportionately impact certain groups and that any adverse action based on background check results are job related and consistent with business necessity. All right. And so the solution really to that common mistake is staying informed about relevant laws and regulations is crucial in ensuring that your background check process are compliant and effective. You should regularly attend such things as webinars like this one, workshops. Also, there are HR conferences available to keep yourself updated on new changes to FCRA or state and local laws. Here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area is the HR Southwest Conference every year in Fort Worth, Texas. And then there are others throughout the state of Texas and even across the country, other HR conferences, which are very helpful keeping abreast of different rule changes or laws. Another thing that you can do to avoid that mistake is engage with your peers and industry experts to share knowledge and stay informed about best practices and legal changes. And then always, especially if you're in doubt about anything when it comes to background screening, I always encourage people to check with your legal employment law experts and legal counsel. Work with your attorneys because they specialize in background check regulations, especially those that specialize in employment law. And they can provide guidance on how to implement a good compliant policy and procedure. All right, next one is failure to obtain proper consent.
You getting tired of that bell, David?
I love that bell. That's good. It's keeping me on track. Not getting written consent from candidates before conducting background checks. Per the FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, a consumer has certain rights and the employer has certain responsibilities to the consumer when obtaining a background check. To ensure that the consumer, the candidate for employment, understands those rights and responsibilities, a release should always be provided in the form of an applicant disclosure. The mistake that some HR professionals make is not providing that disclosure to the candidates before running a background check. Failing to do so could result in legal penalties, including fines or maybe a lawsuit. In addition, you risk the reputation of harming your company's, you risk the harm of ruining your company's reputation when it comes to hiring practices. And the solution is always obtain clear and written consent and inform the candidates about the screening process. And this is your legal requirement under the FCRA and other relevant laws. And this ensures that the employer is compliant with federal and state regulations, avoiding potential legal repercussions such as fines and lawsuits. And make sure that you're obtaining the applicant disclosure even if your background check company says they're handling the process. Many background check companies, even like GroupOne, we provide that as a service to HR departments in the process that we can do an applicant disclosure for them, especially when it comes to like the quick invites that you do with us. We send the applicant an email to do the background check. They complete the information. They then sign the applicant disclosure release. And then you're able to, and then it goes ahead and finishes out the background process. However, if you do that process manually on your own, where your recruiters are entering the information, you're expected at that point to get that on pen and paper, that disclosure completed, and you can upload it into the GroupOne system. But at that point, if you're doing it as an online order in the GroupOne system, for example, you're still going to need to obtain that from the applicant. All right, let's move on here to the next part. And yeah. Oh, and I wanted to make one more point about that, and we mentioned it a little bit up front there, is that the FCRA mentions that that it should be clear and conspicuous, the disclosure agreement. And what they mean by that is that they need to know exactly what they're signing. And so that's why best practice is to make sure that they're signing that agreement separately from their actual application. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes applications will have some kind of disclaimer that we're taking your application, but we're also going to be pulling a background check. That really probably isn't sufficient. I would definitely refer to your legal counsel about that. And one of the ways that you can make sure that it's clear and conspicuous is making sure that that applicant disclosure is a separate document, separate from the application. Incomplete and inaccurate information. When incomplete and
hey, David, there's a man drowning in his paperwork there, huh?
Oh my gosh, that guy is deep inside of that paperwork, and he looks like he needs some help. Somebody get that man some help. Yeah, and so incomplete and inaccurate information is submitted when it's submitted for a background check. It can also lead to poor decision making and potentially harmful outcomes. It also results in delays in getting your background checks back completed in a timely manner. So when it comes to background screening, you should always make sure that you have the candidate's exact social security number, for example, and date of birth at a minimum at the beginning of doing your background check. Beyond that, you're going to need to know where did they go to school and if they graduated, if you're checking for education history. Also knowing where they worked and the dates of employment if you're checking employment history. The mistake that many HR professionals make is that they're relying verifying the information they obtain before they submit the background information to the background screening company for processing. As I've often said, bad information in equals bad information out. What you put in, if you put in bad information, you're just going to get bad information right back. So it really pays to do the legwork up front to make sure that you're getting the proper information entered from the beginning. For example, a social security number, just double checking the social security number before you put that number in. One example of that, GroupOne just recently added into their system a check on that. You may have noticed that, well, the candidates would notice it when they do the quick invites, is it requires them now to enter their social security number twice. Once they put it in the first time, but they have to verify that number the second time. This prevents them or prevents us from running wrong information from the beginning. And so we're trying to help out in that regard to make sure that we're not running the wrong social security number from the beginning. Solution: ensure the information you receive from the candidate is complete and correct. Make sure the information you receive from your candidate is absolutely correct. If you're using GroupOne's quick invite system, for example, consider using draft mode. I think we did a webinar last year with our operations analyst, Steve Fisher, and you can probably go back and find that on our YouTube channel that we talked about draft mode. And draft mode does a lot of things. It can help save you some time. It can make sure that you're getting the proper information entered that you need to run in the background check, and it can also save you money as well. Draft mode allows you to review the information that your candidate provides before you commit the order for processing. You can update things like their employment, their education history. For example, they may be giving you information that you don't need to know about them. For example, they give you that they worked at Bob's Burgers back 20 years ago. You most likely probably don't need to know Bob's Burger information.
Stop it, David. You're making me hungry.
But if you're hiring maybe for a hospital technician, you would want to know that they had lots of experience maybe working at Medical City in Dallas or something like that. That's going to be relevant to the job position, and that draft mode allows you to get just the information that you need. Next part is don't be afraid to reach out to your candidates to obtain additional information when it's needed. It's always the best to make sure you have complete and accurate information from the beginning of the process to ensure that you're going to get the right information back on your background screen report. And sometimes HR professionals were guilty of this, is we feel like we had the interview with the candidate and we got all the information that we needed, and we don't really want to bother them or call them back. But man, it's well worth the time to pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, I just want to verify this information to see if it's correct before we move forward with your background check. Next is recently GroupOne added, and I just actually talked about this, we added a feature that double checks the social security number on the quick invite system so that when a candidate's entering their social security number, as I said before, it has them enter it twice just to make sure that we're getting the right information from the beginning. GroupOne also added a new protective layer where the social security trace may be returned back to you with a red flag. Some of you might have been noticing this. We got a few calls when we first instituted this, and what that does is the red flag may wave if a candidate's name is associated with a death registry, and then it may be returned back to you also if the social security number may not be associated with a candidate's name that they provided. So double check those names. It doesn't mean necessarily anything bad. It just means you need to pay attention to those social security numbers. And the extra layer of protection is to help ensure that GroupOne is doing our best to alert you of potentially improper information that may have been entered by the candidates. All right.
There we go again.
That bell really keeps me on my toes there, Chris. I appreciate that. Poor communication with candidates. That mistake, not keeping candidates informed about the status of their background checks. Along with not getting complete information from a candidate, a common mistake employers make is not following up with candidates to ask additional questions after preliminary interviews. kind of talked about this a little while ago. Sometimes a recruiter may think, yeah, you're bothering the candidate by asking too many questions, but it really is a bigger mistake by not asking additional questions that are necessary to know as much as possible about the candidate. And by asking more questions at the front, you really will save a lot of time and money at the start and avoid entering incomplete information. A common mistake employers make is not following up with the candidates to ask those questions. And by asking more of those questions, you really are going to save yourself a lot of time and money. And also, when it comes to hiring a candidate for your organization, a lack of communication can cause delays, and delays can cause the candidate to lose interest in your position and potentially go somewhere else to find a job, and you don't want to lose those candidates. Solution: maintain open and transparent communication throughout the screening process. The truth is, it's better to over communicate with candidates than not. It makes for a better employee experience, and the candidates really appreciate the communication and the transparency, and helps them know that you're moving forward with the background screening process. It keeps the candidate in the loop, and they know that you as a company are interested in keeping them as a candidate, and this keeps them from going and looking someplace else. In the end, you get the information you need to make the most informed and best decision for your organization. Bad timing for obtaining a background check.
David, that looks like a stern taskmaster there. You do not want to have bad timing with her.
Yeah, I don't think I want to mess with her at all. You did a great job in picking out some of these pictures. The mistake really is obtaining, as far as timing, just not having the right timing for obtaining a background check. Another mistake that is made often is those ordering background checks is to request a background check on someone who has not yet been made an offer of employment. By requesting a background check prior to being made an offer of employment, the background check is really then being used as a vetting tool for employment. And there's a lot of risk that can be associated with doing that. One is potential discrimination claims. Conducting background checks before extending a job offer can lead to claims of discrimination. If a candidate is not hired after a pre-offer background check, they may allege that the decision was based on information maybe related to race, religion, national origin, or any of the other protected classes revealed during the check. The other part is privacy concerns. Conducting background checks before making a job offer could raise privacy concerns. Candidates may feel that their personal information is being assessed prematurely and without justification. And this could damage your reputation as an employer and deter top talent from coming to your company. And another part is just wasted resources. Conducting background checks before making a job offer, it can be inefficient and costly. If a candidate is not ultimately selected for the position, the resources then are spent on background checks are wasted. By waiting until and after a conditional offer is made, the employers can ensure that the background checks are only being conducted on candidates that are going to be hired or potentially hired in your organization, rather than you paying for background checks on every single candidate for a position. Only use it on the ones that are been made offers for employment. And solution, which is some of those that we just shared with you there. Make a conditional offer. Always make the offer of employment, and then and only then obtain the background check report. So make a conditional offer to the candidate before requesting a background check. That ensures that the background check is part of the final hiring process and not used as a preliminary vetting or improper vetting tool. This will ensure that you're not jeopardizing the hiring process and opening yourself up to legal or privacy concerns. In addition, you're not going to waste resources by running background checks on people that you don't need to run background checks on. All right. Next one's an interesting one. Overlooking social media screening risks.
This is a real hot potato in our society, David.
Yeah, it is, Chris. Using social media profiles without considering privacy and discrimination issues. And this is, it is a kind of a hot potato because it's kind of controversial, and many background screening companies don't do them. There are some out there that do. GroupOne background screening has chosen, at least at this time, we do not offer a social media search, and I'm going to tell you why. But many times here at GroupOne, we are asked if we offer social media searches. And let me just tell you what a social media search is, or at least what it consists of. Social media search is where an employer looks at public profiles on major social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram.
Hey, now, David, Twitter is called X today.
You're right. And I can't quite get used to calling it X yet. I still call it Twitter.
I do too.
Employers want to look at social media platforms to gain insight on employee character, qualities, values, and to see whether or not they feel like the employee might be a good fit in their workplace or not. The mistake, though, is that employers may not recognize the sizable risk that they're taking in viewing social media profiles. And so what are some of those risks? There are a couple of legal concerns involving bias and discrimination and employee privacy concerns. Sorry, I got confused on my notes there. The part about bias and discrimination is there's a risk of unconscious bias influencing hiring decisions based on a candidate's social media activity. And then the other part is the privacy concerns. Candidates may feel that their privacy is being invaded, leading to negative perceptions of you as the employer.
Checking social media, it's just so risky.
Yeah, it really is. It's just a risky thing to do because you're seeing things, you're seeing what the candidate looks like. If you're looking on Facebook pictures, and you can identify such things as their race, you might identify things of maybe their sexual preferences, their religion. There are just so many things that can be really risky about looking at somebody's social profile. And the solution is really, if you're going to do it, develop a clear policy for social media screening and ensure it complies with legal standards. GroupOne, as I said, does not currently provide social media searches, and we would highly advise you to consult with your legal counsel before proceeding with obtaining social media searches. So if you do choose to do this, and we're not saying it's wrong for you to choose to do it, and there's probably a proper way to do it, but we advise you to be consistent and fair. Employers must apply the same criteria to all of their candidates to ensure their process is fair and avoids claims of bias or discrimination. Inconsistent application on social media checks can lead to legal challenges. So just be careful, be consistent and fair. And then next, ensure the information is accurate and reliable. Information found on social media may not always be the most accurate or reliable information. Can you imagine just relying on Facebook to hire somebody? Facebook's known for, one thing may seem true, and then tomorrow it's not true.
I would probably never get hired if that was the case.
Exactly. So information found on social media just may not be the most reliable. So employers should just make sure they verify any critical information through other means before making your final decision based on what you find through a social media search. Inconsistent hiring practices. The mistake here really is applying different screening standards to different candidates.
Yeah, you can't do that.
No, you don't want to do that. Running a background check with employment verification for one candidate, for example, if you need to run employment verification, but you don't run it for another candidate, that you would still run an employment verification. Or maybe running a motor vehicle report, an MVR, on one candidate that's in a driving position, for example, but then you hire another candidate that's in that same driving position, but you didn't require him or her to have an MVR. Or maybe you're doing a drug screen on some of your candidates or even some of your employees, but you don't do it for all of your employees, is really an inconsistent practice that's a recipe for disaster. The mistake is considered inconsistent hiring, and it gets many HR professionals into trouble. So by being consistent with your hiring practices, or by not being consistent, in other words, you open yourself up to unfair, discriminatory legal action. And maybe by giving a drug screen to one candidate versus another, the candidate may claim that you are singling them out and discriminating against them for some reason. So you always want to be, and that really is the solution, is being consistent. Standardize your process to ensure fairness and consistency. A standardized process leads to more reliable and higher quality hires. By evaluating all your candidates using the same criteria, being consistent, employers can better identify the most suitable candidate for the job and avoid any of those claims of discrimination. Not verifying employment and educational history. All right, let's see. So if you need to check, first of all, I guess the first thing you want to do is, do I need to check employment or education? And that would always be based on the job description for whatever you're hiring. We do a lot of background screening for hospitals, and sometimes we have clinical positions in the hospital, and those, they do often check employment, professional licenses. And then we have non-clinical positions. Maybe they're working in dietary aid and they're helping out in the cafeteria. You may not necessarily need to know all their employment history, but you would want to know their criminal history. So the mistake really is failing to identify a candidate's employment and educational claims on positions that require a candidate's entire history. And believe it or not, I have some statistics here. People do lie, believe it or not, Chris, on their resumes and the information they provide to background screening companies.
Yeah, I think quite a few recent politicians have been caught doing this.
Yeah, that's funny you say that. I've always heard that if you see a politician's mouth moving, they're probably not telling you the truth. So that's what I've always heard. Bad joke, but I've always heard that. Anyway, according to Resume Builder, who conducted this resume actually just recently in December of 2024, they came up with these results. They said that it was 32% of people admitted to lying on their resume. Many of them were frequent among the high earners, the liars. And then the most common lie was on the years of experience they had working at their companies. 80% of the people who lied were actually hired, but nearly half had their job offer rescinded after being caught. So that sounds like a big mistake. So
that's a lot of wasted time there.
A lot of wasted time. And then you got to go back through the hiring process if you have to refill those positions. So if applicants are lying on their resume, the biggest mistake that you can make is ignoring these statistics and trusting without verifying that their employment and educational history is true or not. And I had a story to share here with you. Nice slide there, calling Dr. Love. I have a story.
So that was his name, Dr. Love. Isn't there a song about calling Dr. Love?
Yeah, I think it's a Kiss song. It's actually from the 70s, I believe. But the story I'm going to tell you here is one notable scary example was a doctor, or wasn't really a doctor, but his name was Malachi Love-Robinson. You can look this story up on the internet if you have some extra time, but he gained infamy for impersonating a doctor at the age of 18 years old. And I guess this was in 2016. He opened up a medical practice in Florida, calling it the New Birth, New Life Medical Center. The so-called Dr. Robinson, who referred to himself as Dr. Love, performed medical examinations and provided treatments without actually having any medical qualifications. So obviously and it sounds like he went into his own business, but if somebody had tried to hire him, he would have had no qualifications or credentials to verify. He was actually then caught after an undercover operation by the Department of Health and Human Services, and he was sentenced for prison for practicing without a license. The case underscores the importance, though, of credential checking and thorough investigation of credential verifications to prevent such dangerous impersonations or bringing them into your hospital. Let's see here. What was I going to tell you? Oh, and according to the story, this was also interesting, is this gentleman, I call him a gentleman very lightly, according to the story by ABC News in 2023, after being released from prison, Dr. Love, or the so-called Dr. Love, was hired then by another employer and then arrested for stealing over $10,000 from his employer in a scam. So,
wow. Talk about a bad hiring decision.
Absolutely. So obviously there was not a very good or not a thorough or maybe no background check was run at all. Otherwise, they would have been able to verify that this person shouldn't have been hired in the first place. So that was the mistake. The solution, though, conduct thorough checks to confirm the accuracy of a candidate's resume. Use a professional background check service to verify employment history, education, and or other credentials to verify previous employers and educational institutions. This can be a time-consuming and costly task that you can do, of course, yourself, but you can use a background screening company like GroupOne to help you with that. In some industries, this can not only lead to a negative culture, but fill the workplace, if you don't do it, with potentially dangerous person who does not have the credentials or education to perform the job they're being assigned to, like hiring a Dr. Love, for example. Oh, there's those red flags we were talking about.
There we go.
Neglecting to follow up on red flags. The mistake here is ignoring potential issues identified in background checks. So, what should you do when you encounter negative information on a background screening report? In GroupOne, a red flag will appear when a discrepancy is identified. Y'all probably familiar with those, and hopefully you don't see too many of them, but if you do, you should always review a discrepancy and determine if it violates your hiring policy. Never, 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 ever look past a red flag. Ignoring or overlooking adverse information could endanger your organization and workplace by allowing someone unqualified, like the Dr. Love, to pass through. Don't make that mistake.
Yeah, so I guess a red flag would be sort of a warning flag here, right?
It definitely is something to pay attention to. Whenever you counter a red flag, ensure that you investigate thoroughly the information, whether it's a criminal conviction, a discrepancy in employment, positions, or dates. I always tell people that if you see a red flag, and especially in the GroupOne system that I'm referring to, it doesn't always mean that there's something bad, but it always does mean pay attention. If it's in employment or education, it may just be that your candidate didn't remember their employment dates, or maybe when they graduated from college or high school, especially when you get to be as old as Chris is or myself. It gets a little harder to remember some of those dates and things. But if it's a criminal thing that the red flag is flashing on, it's probably something you definitely want to pay attention to. So the solution is don't ever look past them. Always pay attention to them. And if you notice something, make sure you take action or to either accept or reject the adverse information. Your interpretation and your judgment might be the only barrier preventing an unsuitable employee from joining your workforce.
Yeah, better safe than sorry.
That's always the truth. The next one is failing to properly administer pre-adverse and adverse action letters. All right, and the mistake here is when negative and adverse information is found on a background screening report that prevents you from hiring the candidate based on your policies, it is essential to inform the candidate that this information prevents their employment from progressing. A common mistake among HR professionals is failing to properly notify the candidate by issuing that adverse action letter along with a copy of their background screening report. So the solution is ensure the proper administration of those adverse action letters within the GroupOne system. We provide you with templates that are available that automatically populate the recipient's name and address. And it's recommended, I always recommend send those letters out with the old-fashioned way through the post office, but do the one with the card, the certified mail, so you get that green card back as a receipt showing that the candidate acknowledged it and signed it, and they'll send that back to you, and you can put that in their file. Alternatively, you can send the letters via email, but be careful and be sure to track the candidate's receipt of the email. Make sure to provide a copy of the background screening report as well. This will help the candidates to know exactly why they're not being hired and provides them with a chance to correct any information that may not be true in the dispute process, which we're going to talk about next. Next is failing to properly manage that dispute process. And the mistake there is just not handling the dispute process properly. If a candidate is denied employment due to that adverse information found on their background screen report, it's crucial to follow through and to follow it with the pre-adverse action process to notify them, but additionally, refer the candidate back to the background screening company so they can file a formal dispute if they choose to. A common mistake HR professionals make is attempting to handle the dispute process directly with the candidate, which can expose you to potential legal actions and a lot of extra stress because you're most likely going to get into some kind of an argument or something like that. And wouldn't it be so much better just to let somebody like GroupOne or your background screening company handle the whole dispute process? Solution is refer every one of those back to your background screening company.
So refer them to GroupOne.
That would always be best to go to GroupOne. I'm not just saying that because we are GroupOne, but always send it back to your background screening company because that really is their job to handle the dispute process. And the best way is to handle it is to send them to your background screening company. If it is GroupOne, great. But when you use GroupOne to initiate the pre-adverse or adverse action letter, a formal dispute process notification is also included with that letter. So it clearly tells the candidate how to contact GroupOne to file a dispute with us. And then we have a whole team of people that handle that process from there. So you never have to really talk to or communicate with the candidate from that point on. By following this advice, you protect yourself, of course, from those stressful arguments with the candidate because, of course, they're upset because they want the position they thought they could get. We're going to be able to work at your company. And then they've already got the bad news that they're not going to be able to work at the company and they're really upset and they're going to bring that stress to you. There's no reason for you to handle that stress. So send them to us. We'll take care of the process from there. And you minimize the risk of legal action from potentially mishandling the whole process as well.
Hey, David, this will be the last time you hear this.
I'm going to miss that, Bill. Relying solely on background checks alone.
Hey, this is an interesting topic, and I really wasn't aware of this.
Yeah, making hiring decisions based only on a background check results can be a mistake because there are many other tools an HR or talent acquisition specialist will use to base their hiring decisions upon. One of those tools is the background screening report, of course. However, the mistake that some hiring managers might make is to rely solely upon that report or choosing to write off a candidate for a minor offense that's on that background report. The solution really is when hiring an employee for an organization, use all the recruiting tools to make the decision that's right for your organization. When hiring an employee for your organization, use all the recruiting tools to make the best decision. That includes the interviews, when you actually met with the candidate and talked to them and went back and forth asking them questions, having them ask you questions to make sure that they're a good fit culturally and organizationally with your company. Also checking personal and professional references. And by the way, GroupOne can help you with that as well, as we offer a service called professional reference checking. But calling, their personal references, finding out a little bit more about them. Were they a good worker? Where they worked before and things like that. Assessing their skills and qualifications. Maybe you have some tests, maybe testing them on some of your software? Are they good with Microsoft Word and Excel, PowerPoint, all of those things? Do they really have the right qualifications for the position? And this one sometimes HR people overlook is, are they a good cultural fit? You have a good culture right now, and the company's really has a good team working atmosphere. It only takes bringing one person into the company that kind of has a negative dark cloud kind of an attitude, and next thing you know, your company's all becoming dark. So you want to make sure that you're always getting a cultural fit, and you're not going to get that really from a background screening report. But by using a comprehensive approach like this, you can ensure you're going to get a well-rounded evaluation of each candidate, leading you to a better hiring decision and a stronger team overall.
Well, in other words, it's just, it's not just paperwork.
Yeah, not just paperwork and not just going through the motions, just getting a background screening report and checking off a box, but really use a comprehensive approach, looking at all of your tools to make the best decision. Oh, and by the way, adverse information that's found on a background screening report doesn't always mean that you need to disqualify a candidate from being hired. I mean, depending upon your hiring processes, for instance, what I'm trying to say here is a candidate, maybe they committed a minor misdemeanor many years ago, but has no other offenses since then, and they possess excellent qualifications for the position. Overlooking such talent due to a past mistake could be detrimental to your organization, as you might miss out on maybe a highly qualified candidate for the company, all because they had something on their background check 7 years ago for maybe writing a hot check or something like that. And because you feel like just because they have a negative thing on their background check, we're not going to hire them, you may actually hurt yourself more than help yourself, because people make mistakes and people learn from their mistakes. And by interviewing them and doing a thorough job of interviewing that candidate, you probably learn a lot more about them in a face-to-face interview. And I know a lot of that face-to-face interviews kind of been lost over the years too, because we do a lot more social interaction over interviews through the internet or
Zoom or Teams meetings.
Call. And exactly. And I'm not saying those are all bad, but you can do a lot more sometimes in an interview, talking to somebody to kind of gain a lot more information about them than maybe what the background check's going to give you overall. That concludes our presentation today. However, we've got our contact information up here on the screen. And if you have any questions from today's presentation, please feel free to reach out to myself, David Graves, or Chris Wilson. Both of our phone numbers are up there, as well as our email addresses, and we'd welcome any of those. And depending on how much time, I haven't even looked at the clock here, Chris.
Yeah, we got a few minutes.
We can probably take a few questions.
We actually have a lot of questions, but I wanted to tell you, David, that was an expert presentation. I really appreciate you providing your expertise here to everyone.
Well, I appreciate you organizing it today and doing a great job with the slides. And man, that bell really kept me awake the whole time. So I appreciate that.
Hey, let's go to Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and ask you some questions here that have been written in.
All right, I'll do my best.
What best practices can companies implement to avoid common background screening mistakes like what you mentioned today?
Well, the first thing that really comes to mind is just being consistent, always treating every candidate exactly the same. And what I mean by that is, if you're hiring somebody for, like I talked about earlier, if they're in a driving type of position, is just making sure that you're always consistent. If you're pulling an MVR report on this candidate in a driving position, you should be pulling it on every candidate that's in a driving position. Or if you're doing a drug screen on one candidate, you always want to make sure you're doing the drug screen on all of the candidates. I think consistency overall is always the best way to avoid many of the pitfalls.
I got another question here, and how should we handle discrepancies, or as you mentioned earlier, red flags found on a background screening report?
Yeah, and I think the best advice there is never ignore them. Like I said earlier, if you have a discrepancy or a red flag that's flashing on somebody's background screen report, however your background screening company shows that, don't ignore it, obviously. But don't always assume that it's always something negative. It always just means that there's something there to pay attention to and investigate. So make sure that you look into it thoroughly. like I said earlier, if it's employment or education, it may just be something you need to pay attention to. Maybe somebody made a mistake just on dates of employment. But it could be something if it's an employment thing. Maybe they said that they were a manager of a company, but when you did the further research, our researchers found that they were a fry cook at McDonald's Corporation, but they said they were a manager. That's definitely something that's a red flag you want to pay attention to. And if it's a criminal thing, obviously, if it's against your company's policy to hire, then yeah, you're not going to be able to move forward to. So always pay attention to red flags.
Hey, this is an interesting question that was written in. What would you consider to be the most common error a company makes during background checks?
I would say probably the most common is that probably what we just talked about there is just not being consistent, just to always treat everybody the same and to make sure that when you find, and another one probably is that on the adverse, pre-adverse adverse action is forgetting or failing to send out those adverse or pre-adverse letters action. Many times you decide to move on with another candidate for a position, but that you don't clearly communicate back to the candidate that you're not going to move forward with to let them know why you've decided not to move forward with them. So I think that's another probably big common one, is just failing to send out notifications of why someone's not being hired.
This is a really interesting question. I'm curious as to what your answer would be. How often should we update our background screening policies and procedures?
Yeah, I think probably best practice is to take a look at those probably once a year. And if you see some things that are not updated in your own policies, probably once a year at the minimum, probably take a look at those. And then if you're staying abreast of things like through the FCRA, put yourself maybe on their newsletter. Maybe consult with your legal counsel throughout the year, because there could be changes during the year that you want to be aware of, so that you're making those changes while they're happening. But I would say at a minimum once a year.
Here's another one. What are the potential risks of not conducting thorough background checks?
Yeah, I think we talked about some of those, but probably jeopardizing your workforce, culture, and maybe the safety of your workforce. Those are the potential risks. And then not conducting a background check, also the risk of legal action being done against your company. There's one thing out there called negligent hiring, which most HR professionals know about, and that is if you end up hiring somebody without doing a thorough background check.
Someone like Dr. Love.
Someone like Dr. Love, and then you put them as a head of your surgery department, and they performed a surgery on somebody and it went south and it resulted in the death of a patient, you can expect that your hospital is going to have a large legal lawsuit coming your way, not only with high fines and things like that, but also a negligent hiring lawsuit because you were negligent to check their employment history and their criminal history. So yeah, big mistake.
Okay, we got time for one final question here, David. What would you consider to be the best practices for verifying the accuracy of information provided by candidates?
Yeah, so say that question one more time.
I'm sorry, let me reread it. What are the best practices for verifying the accuracy of information provided by candidates?
Yeah, so you want to always check that information, double check it. For example, I think we talked about that earlier on, checking the social security numbers and things like that. Just make sure you double check the information that you have, and also don't be afraid, like we talked about earlier, to refer back to the candidate and ask more questions. If you're not sure about something that they told you in the interview, if you're not sure about something they provided on their resume, don't hesitate at all to call them back and just get some confirmation so that you're entering the information properly and correctly from the very beginning.
Wow, David, what a great presentation. I wanted to tell the attendees that we had so many questions, we could not get to all of them today. So please feel free to contact David. He's the true expert here. If you need those questions to be answered, he is always available. David, thank you so much. This has been a great webinar.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to our audience today for joining us, and we'll talk to you later in the year.
Thank you. Yeah, we plan to have some more webinars later this year.
Perfect.